The rain hammered against the stained glass windows like 1,000 desperate fingers begging for mercy. Inside the church, Pastor Nathaniel stood at the pulpit, his voice booming through the sanctuary, preaching about compassion and divine love. But when a small boy appeared at the entrance, soaking wet and crying for help, the man of God did something that would haunt an entire community forever. He walked to the door, looked the child straight in the eyes, and slammed it shut with such force the sound echoed like thunder through the silent street. What the congregation discovered about that child would shake their faith to its very foundation. Nathaniel Warren had built his reputation on miracles, or at least that's what people called them. 12 years leading the Cornerstone Community Church, 12 years of packed Sunday services, 12 years of being the voice that promised salvation to anyone willing to listen. His sermons were quoted in coffee shops, his advice sought by politicians, his blessing considered essential for any major life decision in the town of Millbrook. The man wore expensive suits that somehow looked humble, drove a luxury sedan that he claimed was a gift from God, and lived in a house 3 times the size of anyone else's in the neighborhood. Yet nobody questioned it. After all, surely the Lord provides for his most faithful servants. That Sunday morning began like any other. The church bells rang at precisely 9:45, calling the faithful to worship. Margaret, an 82-year-old woman who hadn't missed a service in 37 years, took her usual spot in the third pew. Behind her sat the Fitzgerald family, all 6 of them squeezed together, their youngest daughter still half asleep against her father's shoulder. In the back row, as always, sat Thomas, a mechanic who came every week hoping to find answers to questions he couldn't quite articulate. The organ hummed to life, filling the space with sounds that seemed to lift souls toward the vaulted ceiling. Everything was perfect. Everything was as it should be. Nathaniel emerged from the vestry, his face arranged in that expression of serene authority he'd perfected over the years. Not quite a smile, not quite stern, but something that suggested he possessed knowledge the rest of them could only dream of understanding. He opened his leather-bound Bible. The pages worn from what he claimed were countless hours of study, though several members had noticed the bookmark never seemed to move. His voice began soft, almost a whisper, drawing everyone in. He spoke of forgiveness, of how the Lord embraces even the most broken among us, of how no sin is too great for redemption. The words flowed like honey, sweet and thick, coating everyone in a warmth that felt almost tangible. Outside, the sky had been threatening rain all morning. Dark clouds gathered like mourners at a funeral, blocking out what little autumn sun remained. The first drops began to fall around 10:30, just as Nathaniel reached the crescendo of his sermon. Light taps at first, then harder, faster, until the downpour sounded like applause from heaven itself. Or perhaps something else entirely. Nobody inside paid much attention. They were too focused on the pastor's words, too caught up in the rhythm of his delivery, too comfortable in their cushioned pews to worry about weather. Then came the knocking, quiet at first, barely audible over the rain and the pastor's booming voice. Tap, tap, tap. Nathaniel paused for just a fraction of a second, his eyes flickering toward the main entrance, before continuing. The knocking came again, louder this time. Tap, 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 tap. Several heads turned. Margaret adjusted her hearing aid, thinking perhaps it was malfunctioning. The Fitzgeralds' youngest daughter perked up, always excited by anything that broke routine. Thomas, in the back row, leaned forward, trying to see what was happening. The knocking turned to pounding, desperate, urgent, the sound of small fists against heavy oak, and then, cutting through everything, a child's voice. "Help me, please. Somebody help me." The words were muffled by the door and the rain, but unmistakable. A child outside in the storm, begging for someone to let them in. The entire congregation froze. Nathaniel's face remained perfectly calm, though his knuckles whitened around the edges of the pulpit. He cleared his throat and raised his voice, trying to drown out the sound. But the crying only grew louder, more frantic, more impossible to ignore. "Please, I need help." The voice cracked with desperation. "My mama, she's hurt. Please, somebody." Margaret stood up, her elderly legs surprisingly quick, already moving toward the aisle. Several others shifted in their seats, uncertain, looking to their pastor for guidance. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. He set down his Bible with deliberate slowness and stepped away from the pulpit. His shoes clicked against the marble floor, each step measured and purposeful. The crying continued, punctuated by the hammering rain. Please, please, I'm so cold." Nathaniel reached the door. Everyone watched. He placed his hand on the handle, and for a moment, just a moment, the entire room held its breath. This was their shepherd, their guide, the man who preached about helping the least among them. Surely he would open the door, welcome the child, offer shelter from the storm. Margaret had almost reached the entrance herself, ready to help however she could. But Nathaniel moved faster. He pulled the door open just a crack, just enough to see outside. Just enough for everyone to catch a glimpse of a small boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, drenched to the bone, his clothes torn and muddy, his face streaked with tears and something that might have been blood. The boy reached out a trembling hand. "Sir, please. My mama fell down the ravine by Miller Road. She's not moving. I ran all the way here because I saw the church and thought," but he never finished. Nathaniel's face remained a mask of stone. Without a word, without hesitation, he pushed the door shut. The boy's hand was still reaching through when the heavy oak slammed closed, missing his fingers by inches. The sound echoed through the sanctuary like a gunshot. The lock clicked into place with terrible finality. Outside, the boy's crying turned to wailing, then slowly faded as small footsteps ran back into the rain. The silence inside the church was absolute. Margaret stood frozen in the aisle, her mouth open in shock. Thomas had risen from his seat, his face pale. The Fitzgeralds stared at their pastor as if seeing him for the first time. Even the youngest children seemed to understand that something terrible had just happened. Nathaniel turned back to face his congregation, smoothing down his suit jacket, that serene expression still plastered on his face like a mask. He walked back to the pulpit as if nothing had occurred. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his voice steady, "we must not be distracted by every disruption. The devil tests us in many forms." But Margaret wasn't having it. Her voice, usually so soft and deferential, rang out sharp and clear. That was a child begging for help. Nathaniel's eyes fixed on her, cold and hard. "And we have a service to complete. Whatever situation exists outside these walls can be dealt with after we finish God's work." "God's work?" Thomas found his own voice, rough from years of breathing engine fumes. That boy said his mother was hurt. She could be dying. The pastor's smile never wavered, but something dangerous flashed in his eyes. "I'm sure it's simply a child's overactive imagination. You know how dramatic young ones can be. They see a scraped knee and think it's the end of the world." Several people stood up. A woman named Patricia, who ran the church daycare, spoke up, her voice trembling. "I'm going to check on him. I'm going outside." Others nodded, moving toward the door, but Nathaniel's voice cracked like a whip. "Sit down, all of you, right now." The authority in his tone, the same authority that had commanded this room for 12 years, made several people hesitate. But not everyone. Margaret was already at the door, her arthritic fingers fumbling with the lock. Thomas joined her, and together they pushed it open. The rain hit them immediately, soaking through their Sunday clothes in seconds, but they didn't care. They looked left and right, searching for any sign of the boy. "There," Patricia called out, pointing down the street. A small figure was running, stumbling really, heading toward the old Miller Road that wound up into the hills. "Wait!" Margaret tried to shout, but her voice was lost in the storm. Thomas was already running, his dress shoes slipping on the wet pavement. Several others poured out of the church behind them, ignoring Nathaniel's increasingly angry commands to return. Inside the sanctuary, those who remained sat in stunned silence. Nathaniel stood at the pulpit, his carefully constructed world beginning to crack. He tried to continue his sermon, but the words came out hollow, meaningless. The Fitzgeralds gathered their children and left without a word. Then another family. Then another. Within 10 minutes, the church that had been packed was now 3/4 empty. Only the most loyal, or perhaps the most afraid, remained, and even they couldn't quite meet their pastor's eyes. Outside, Thomas had caught up to the boy. The child had collapsed near the corner where Miller Road began its steep climb into the forested hills. He was shaking violently, whether from cold or terror or both. Thomas knelt beside him, trying to shield him from the worst of the rain with his own body. "Hey, son. Hey, it's okay now. We're here to help." The boy looked up, his eyes huge and filled with a fear that no child should ever have to feel. "My mama," he gasped between sobs. She went over the edge. "There's so much blood. We have to help her. Margaret and the others arrived moments later. Someone had the sense to grab blankets from their car. They wrapped the boy up, but he kept trying to pull away, kept trying to run back toward the road. "She's up there," he cried. "Please, we have to go now." Thomas looked at Margaret. "Call 911 now." As Margaret fumbled with her phone, her hands shaking from cold and adrenaline, Thomas turned to the group. "Who's coming with me? We need to find this boy's mother." 6 people volunteered immediately, including Patricia and a younger man named David, who was training to be an EMT. The group made their way up Miller Road, the boy leading, despite his exhausted state. The rain had turned the path treacherous, mud sucking at their shoes with each step. Tree branches hung low, heavy with water, dripping on them as they passed. The boy kept looking back, making sure they were following, his face a mask of desperate hope and terrible fear. "It's just around the next bend," he kept saying. "Please hurry, please." And then they saw it. The guardrail was smashed, twisted metal pointing toward the sky like accusing fingers. Fresh tire marks scarred the muddy road, leading straight to the gap. Thomas approached carefully, looking over the edge. The ravine dropped away sharply, 40 or 50 feet down to a rocky creek bed below. And there, crumpled against the stones, was a car, an old sedan, its front end completely destroyed, lying on its side. And next to it, barely visible through the rain, a figure, a woman, motionless. "Oh God," Patricia whispered. Thomas was already moving, carefully making his way down the steep slope, grabbing onto roots and rocks to keep from sliding. David followed close behind. The descent seemed to take forever, every second an eternity. The boy above them screamed for his mother, his voice raw and broken. Margaret held him back, preventing him from trying to follow, her own tears mixing with the rain on her face. Thomas reached the bottom, his heart pounding. The woman was face down in the mud, one arm twisted at an unnatural angle, blood matting her dark hair. He knelt beside her, pressing his fingers to her neck, praying for a pulse. For a long moment, he felt nothing. Then, there, faint, irregular, but there. "She's alive," he shouted up. "Barely, but she's alive." The relief that washed over the group was palpable, but mixed with the terrible knowledge of how close it had been. How many minutes had been wasted while Nathaniel finished his sermon? The ambulance arrived 15 minutes later, along with a fire truck and 2 police cars. The EMTs worked with practiced efficiency, stabilizing the woman's neck, checking her vitals, preparing her for transport. She had a severe head injury, multiple broken bones, and was slipping in and out of consciousness. When she was conscious, she kept whispering one word: "Evan." "That's his name," one of the EMTs said. "The boy, Evan." They loaded her onto a stretcher, the process made nearly impossible by the terrain and the continuing rain. It took 6 people to carry her up the slope, moving inch by careful inch. Evan watched it all with eyes too old for his face. When they finally brought his mother up to the road and loaded her into the ambulance, he tried to climb in with her. "I need to stay with her," he pleaded. "I need to." The female EMT, a woman with kind eyes and gentle hands, knelt down to his level. "We're going to take such good care of her, sweetheart. But right now you're going to go with this nice police officer, okay? He's going to take you to the hospital too, and we'll make sure you can see your mama as soon as possible. I promise." The police officer, a middle-aged man named Reeves, wrapped another blanket around Evan's shoulders. "Come on, son. Let's get you warm and dry." As they walked to the patrol car, Reeves asked gently, "You said you went to the church for help?" Evan nodded, his teeth chattering. "My mama always said churches are safe places. She said people there help others." But the man, the boy's voice broke. He just closed the door. He looked at me like I was nothing and he closed the door. Officer Reeves's jaw tightened. Which church was this? Cornerstone Community, Evan whispered. The big one with the white steeple. Reeves knew it well. Everyone in Millbrook knew Cornerstone. He made a mental note to follow up on that particular detail later. Right now, getting this child to the hospital was the priority. But something cold and angry had settled in his chest. A man of God had turned away a child in need. A child whose mother might have died because of those wasted minutes. At the hospital, Evan sat in a chair too big for him, wrapped in heated blankets, a cup of hot chocolate cooling in his small hands. Margaret had insisted on coming with him, refusing to leave him alone. The doctors were with his mother now, working to stabilize her condition before surgery. The prognosis wasn't good. Severe head trauma, internal bleeding, a crushed pelvis, broken ribs. She'd survived the initial fall, but the next 24 hours would be critical. Every minute counted, every single minute that had been wasted while Nathaniel Warren stood at his pulpit and preached about love. Back at the church, Nathaniel found himself addressing an increasingly hostile crowd. Word had spread fast. In a town like Millbrook, news traveled faster than wildfire. People who hadn't been at the service that morning were now showing up, demanding answers. The local newspaper editor was there, the owner of the town's largest employer, the mayor, and dozens of ordinary citizens who had once revered Pastor Warren but were now looking at him with expressions ranging from confusion to disgust. "I did what I felt was right in the moment," Nathaniel said, his voice still trying to maintain that authoritative tone. "We cannot allow every distraction to interrupt our worship. The church is a sacred space." A woman in the crowd, someone Nathaniel had counseled through her divorce 3 years ago, stepped forward. "A child came to you for help. His mother was dying, and you slammed a door in his face. How is that sacred?" Nathaniel's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something ugly underneath. "You weren't there. You don't understand the full context." "But I was there." Margaret's voice cut through the murmur of the crowd. She had returned from the hospital, leaving Evan in the care of Patricia. "I saw everything. That little boy was desperate, injured, terrified. He told you his mother was hurt and needed help, and you dismissed him like he was an inconvenience." The crowd's anger grew. More voices joined in, asking questions, demanding explanations. "Why did you close the door? Why didn't you call for help? Why did you care more about your sermon than a child's life?" Thomas pushed his way to the front. He was still muddy from the ravine, his Sunday clothes ruined, but he didn't care. "That woman, Evan's mother, she nearly died. She's in surgery right now. The doctors said if we'd gotten there even 10 minutes later, she probably wouldn't have made it. 10 minutes. That's how close it was." He looked directly at Nathaniel. "How long did you keep preaching after you shut that door? 15 minutes? 20? The pastor's face paled. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. No words came out. The mayor stepped forward, his expression grave. "Nathaniel, I think it's best if you step away from your duties for now. Until we can properly investigate what happened here, the church board will need to meet. There will be questions. Many questions." Nathaniel's eyes widened. "You can't be serious. I've led this congregation for 12 years. I've done nothing wrong. I made a judgment call." "Nothing wrong?" Thomas's voice was barely controlled rage. "A child came to you for help and you turned him away. If that's your idea of nothing wrong, then you've been preaching lies for 12 years. The crowd's support was clearly with Thomas. Nathaniel could see it in their faces, in the way they'd physically drawn back from him, creating space as if his presence itself was contaminating. "This is absurd," he tried one more time. "You're all overreacting. An unfortunate situation, yes, but hardly my fault. If the child had been clearer, if he'd explained better." Margaret's laugh was bitter. "He told you his mother fell down a ravine. How much clearer did he need to be? You understood perfectly. You just didn't care." The police arrived then, Officer Reeves among them. He'd heard about the confrontation at the church and decided it warranted attention. "Pastor Warren," he said calmly, "we'd like to ask you some questions down at the station. About your actions this morning." Nathaniel's face flushed red. "Am I being arrested?" "Not at this time," Reeves replied. "But we are investigating. There may be legal implications for failure to render aid, especially given your position as a community leader." The pastor's carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. He looked at the faces of people who had once hung on his every word, who had sought his blessing for their children, who had trusted him with their confessions and their faith. Now they looked at him like a stranger, or worse, like someone they'd finally seen clearly for the first time. The church board met that evening in an emergency session. Nathaniel wasn't invited. The discussion was heated, painful, and ultimately decisive. By unanimous vote, Pastor Nathaniel Warren was suspended indefinitely. An independent investigation would be launched, the congregation would be informed, and an interim pastor would be brought in. For 12 years, Nathaniel had been the undisputed authority. Now, in a single day, it was all gone. At the hospital, Evan sat by his mother's bedside. She'd survived the surgery, though the doctors warned the family that she faced a long, difficult recovery. Multiple surgeries would be needed. Physical therapy would take months, maybe years. There would be bills, enormous bills, that Evan's mother, a single parent who worked 2 jobs just to keep them housed and fed, could never hope to pay. But she was alive. Against odds that had been frighteningly slim, she was alive. Evan held her hand gently, careful not to disturb the IV lines. "I'm sorry, Mama," he whispered. "I tried to get help faster. I ran as fast as I could." His mother's eyes fluttered open, still hazy from anesthesia and pain medication. She squeezed his hand weakly. "You saved my life, baby. You ran for help. You were so brave." Tears rolled down Evan's face. "But the church, Mama. You said churches were safe. You said people there would help." His voice broke. Why did he close the door? Margaret, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, felt her heart shatter. She moved closer, placing a gentle hand on Evan's shoulder. "That man was wrong, sweetheart. What he did was wrong. But those other people, the ones who came to help you, they're from that church too. And they did what was right. Not everyone is like Pastor Warren." Evan looked up at her with eyes that had learned too much too fast, but he was supposed to be the best one. If the pastor won't help, why would anyone else? The question hung in the air, unanswerable. How do you explain to a child that sometimes the people who claim to be closest to God are the farthest from his teachings? How do you restore faith that's been shattered by hypocrisy? Margaret didn't have those answers. She just held the boy's hand and promised silently that she would do better. They all would do better. The story spread beyond Millbrook. Regional news picked it up. Pastor slams door on child seeking help for injured mother. The video footage from someone's phone, shaky and rain-soaked but damning, went viral. Millions of views, thousands of comments. The outrage was swift and merciless. Nathaniel's face became synonymous with religious hypocrisy. His name became a byword for false piety. Churches across the country used him as an example in sermons about what not to do, about how power corrupts, about how titles mean nothing if actions contradict teachings. Nathaniel himself retreated from public view. His house, that enormous symbol of his success, went up for sale. He couldn't walk down Millbrook streets without people staring, whispering, sometimes shouting. His wife, who had stood by his side for 20 years, left him. She couldn't reconcile the man she'd married with the man who'd slammed a door on a desperate child. Their adult children stopped returning his calls. He'd built his entire identity on being Pastor Warren, spiritual leader, moral authority. Now he was just Nathaniel, alone with nothing but the echoes of his own empty words for company. The investigation revealed more uncomfortable truths. Church funds had been mismanaged. Nathaniel's lifestyle had been funded not by divine providence, but by careful manipulation of donation records. Several women came forward with stories of inappropriate behavior, of advances made under the guise of spiritual counseling. The golden image tarnished completely, revealing rust and rot underneath. Everything he'd built was built on sand, and the rain had finally come to wash it all away. At Cornerstone Community Church, healing was slow. The interim pastor, a woman named Reverend Sarah Coleman, approached her temporary role with humility and transparency. She held open forums where people could express their hurt, their anger, their confusion. She acknowledged that the church had failed Evan, had failed his mother, had failed the entire community. And she promised that together they would find a way forward. Not by pretending it hadn't happened, but by confronting it head-on and learning from it. The church community rallied around Evan and his mother. Medical bills were paid through fundraisers. Meals were delivered. Physical therapy was arranged. Margaret became a fixture in their lives, a grandmother figure who'd proven that her faith meant more than words on Sunday morning. Thomas used his mechanic skills to repair Evan's mother's car, which had been totaled in the accident. Actually, he did more than repair it. He replaced it entirely with a better one, safer, more reliable. It was what neighbors did, what community meant. Months passed. Evan's mother, whose name was Rachel, slowly recovered. She'd walk with a limp for the rest of her life. Chronic pain would be her constant companion, but she was alive, and she was able to be there for her son. That was worth everything. Evan himself struggled with nightmares, with trust issues, with a fear of asking for help that broke Rachel's heart. They started therapy, both of them, working through the trauma of that day. One Sunday, 6 months after the incident, Rachel and Evan walked through the doors of Cornerstone Community Church. It was the first time either had been inside since that terrible morning. The congregation saw them enter and fell silent. Then slowly, people began to stand. Not in judgment, not in pity, but in acknowledgement, in apology, in welcome. Margaret rushed over, tears streaming down her face, and wrapped them both in a hug that felt like coming home. Reverend Coleman invited Rachel and Evan to sit in the front row. During her sermon, she spoke about second chances, about how institutions like people can fail and must take responsibility, about how a building doesn't make a church, people do, and people are flawed, broken, capable of terrible mistakes, but also capable of learning, growing, and choosing differently. She looked directly at Evan. You showed us what courage looks like. You reminded us what we're supposed to be. Thank you for giving us the chance to do better. After the service, people approached Rachel and Evan, not with the hollow platitudes that often follow tragedy, but with genuine connection, offers of friendship, invitations to dinners, promises to be there, not just in crisis, but in the everyday mundane struggles of life. The church, under Reverend Coleman's leadership, had transformed, no longer focused on appearances and performance, but on actual community, on showing up, on opening doors instead of closing them. Nathaniel Warren watched this all from a distance. Not physically present, he'd left Millbrook entirely, but through the same social media that had destroyed his reputation. He saw the photos of the thriving congregation. He read articles about Reverend Coleman's leadership. He learned that church attendance had actually grown, that people were flooding back precisely because the institution had been willing to admit its failures and change. Everything he'd built had crumbled, and somehow, in the ruins, something better was growing. Late one night, sitting alone in a small apartment 3 states away, Nathaniel typed out a message to Rachel. He wrote and rewrote it a dozen times. An apology felt hollow. An explanation felt like an excuse. In the end, he wrote simply, I was wrong. What I did to your son, to you, was unforgivable. I spent 12 years preaching about God's love while understanding nothing about love at all. You and Evan deserved better. Everyone deserved better. I'm sorry. He hesitated over the send button for 10 full minutes before finally pressing it. Rachel received the message while folding laundry, Evan doing homework at the kitchen table. She read it twice, then set her phone down. Evan noticed her expression. What's wrong, Mama? She smiled, though it was complicated, layered with emotions she couldn't quite name. Nothing's wrong, baby. Just someone finally saying something they should have said a long time ago. She didn't respond to Nathaniel's message. Some things didn't need a response. Some apologies could be acknowledged without being accepted. Some bridges, once burned, weren't meant to be rebuilt. A year after the incident, Cornerstone Community Church held a special dedication ceremony. They'd installed a new set of doors at the main entrance, beautiful oak, hand-carved with images of people helping each other. At the bottom of the left door was an inscription. These doors remain unlocked, always. Beneath that, smaller but equally important, in memory of the child we failed, and in promise to the community we will be. Evan was invited to help with the ribbon cutting. His small hands held the scissors alongside Reverend Coleman's, and together they cut the ribbon, officially opening doors that now symbolized everything a church should be. The local newspaper covered the event. The headline read, Church finds redemption through action, not words. The article detailed the transformation of Cornerstone, how one terrible moment had sparked genuine change. It interviewed congregation members who spoke about learning to see beyond performance and prestige to actual service. It quoted Thomas saying, We learned that faith isn't what you say on Sunday. It's what you do when someone knocks on your door in the rain. Evan, now 10 years old, had grown from the experience, not unscathed, but stronger in ways that mattered. He still remembered that day vividly, still sometimes woke up hearing the sound of that door slamming. But he also remembered Margaret running into the rain, Thomas climbing down the ravine, Patricia holding his hand in the hospital, David helping carry his mother up the slope. All the people who'd shown him that one man's failure didn't define everyone, that for every closed door there were people willing to smash through walls, if that's what it took to help. Rachel started volunteering at the church, helping with their new community outreach program. She organized meal deliveries for families in crisis. She sat with people in hospital waiting rooms. She answered phones on the crisis helpline they'd established. Everything she did was informed by that day, by knowing how crucial help could be, how life and death urgent those moments were when someone reached out. She made sure that nobody calling Cornerstone for help would ever be turned away. On the second anniversary of the incident, Reverend Coleman dedicated her sermon to the topic of doors, how they can shut people out or invite them in, how they can represent safety or rejection, how the church's job is to be the door that always opens, the threshold that welcomes rather than excludes. She spoke about how Nathaniel Warren's action, terrible as it was, had become a catalyst, how sometimes God works through our failures to teach us what we should have known all along, how brokenness, when acknowledged and addressed, can lead to healing stronger than what existed before. Evan sat in the front row with his mother, listening. When the sermon ended, Reverend Coleman asked if he wanted to say anything. He was shy by nature, made more so by trauma, but he stood up. His voice was quiet but steady. I used to hate that day. I used to wish it never happened. But my mama told me something. She said sometimes bad things happen so good things can grow. Like how forest fires make room for new trees, I think that's what happened here. Something bad made room for something good. And even though it hurt, even though I was scared, I'm glad these people are who they are now. I'm glad I know them. There wasn't a dry eye in the building. Margaret openly sobbed. Thomas had to excuse himself to collect his composure. Rachel held her son close, pride and pain mixing in her chest. This child, this brave, thoughtful child, had found meaning in trauma, had chosen forgiveness not because what happened was okay, but because holding on to hate would have hurt him more than it hurt anyone else. He'd learned what Nathaniel never had, that faith isn't about being right or powerful or revered. It's about showing up. It's about opening doors. The story of what happened at Cornerstone became part of Millbrook's identity, not hidden away in shame, but acknowledged as a turning point. Other institutions in town took notice. The hospital revised its policies on crisis intervention. The police department enhanced training on community resources. The school system implemented programs teaching children that asking for help is brave, not weak, and that adults have a responsibility to respond. One man's failure had rippled outward, creating positive change in unexpected places. Nathaniel himself never returned to ministry. He took a job in a warehouse stacking boxes, anonymous labor that required no authority and offered no platform. He lived simply, quietly, the opposite of his previous life of performance and prestige. Sometimes late at night, he'd find himself online, reading about Cornerstone's transformation. Part of him wanted to feel vindicated, to point to some silver lining that justified his actions, but he couldn't. There was no redemption in what he'd done. The good that followed came despite him, not because of him. That distinction mattered. He did find a small church eventually, not to lead, just to attend. He sat in the back row, never speaking, never drawing attention. He listened to sermons about grace and mercy and wondered if such things could apply to someone like him. He saw other congregants greeting each other, forming community, supporting each other through life's struggles. He saw what he'd failed to build at Cornerstone, what Reverend Coleman had created from the ashes of his failure. And he felt something he hadn't felt in years, genuine humility. Not the performed humility he'd worn like a costume, but real acknowledgement of how much he didn't know, how much he'd gotten wrong. Years continued to pass. Evan grew into a teenager, then a young man. He carried scars, visible and invisible, but he also carried purpose. He studied social work in college, driven by that childhood experience to be someone who opens doors. His mother watched him graduate with tears of joy and pride. Margaret, now in her late 80s, sat beside her, the unlikely grandmother who'd run into the rain and never stopped running toward people in need. Cornerstone Community Church thrived. Reverend Coleman eventually retired, but the culture she'd helped build remained. The next pastor, and the one after that, maintained the commitment to genuine service over performance. The unlocked doors became a symbol throughout the region. Other churches adopted similar practices. The ripple effects continued outward, touching lives that had never heard of Millbrook or Nathaniel Warren or that rainy Sunday morning. Thomas, now grey-haired and slower but no less determined, still told the story to anyone who'd listen. Not to shame Nathaniel, but to remind people what mattered. Actions over words, opening over closing, running toward crisis instead of away from it. He'd become something of a local legend, the mechanic who'd climbed down a ravine in his Sunday suit to save a woman's life. But he always redirected the credit. It was Evan who was brave. He was the one who kept trying, who didn't give up even after that door slammed. We just did what any decent person should do. On the 10th anniversary of the incident, the town of Millbrook held a community event at Cornerstone Church. They called it the Open Door Festival, a celebration of the ways the community had grown and changed. There were speeches and music and shared meals. Rachel told her story, her voice strong and clear. Evan spoke about his journey from frightened child to social worker helping others. Margaret, frail but fierce, talked about how that day had transformed her understanding of faith. Thomas demonstrated with characteristic humor that he could still climb down a ravine if needed, though maybe not as quickly as before. The event drew people from across the state. Other communities dealing with institutional failures came to learn. Churches wrestling with their own hypocrisies came seeking guidance. Families who'd experienced trauma came looking for hope, and they found it. Not in the form of easy answers or miraculous healing, but in the messy, complicated, beautiful reality of people choosing to do better, choosing to open doors, choosing to run into the rain. In his small apartment 3 states away, Nathaniel read about the festival online. He looked at pictures of Evan, now a grown man, smiling beside his mother. He saw the church transformed and thriving. He read quotes from community members about how everything had changed because they'd confronted failure instead of hiding it. And he felt the full weight of what he'd lost. Not the prestige or the power or the platform. Those had always been hollow. But the chance to be part of something real, something that mattered, that's what he'd thrown away when he closed that door. He'd spent years trying to justify it, to rationalize it, to find some angle that made him less culpable. But there was none. He'd seen a child in need and chosen convenience over compassion. He'd valued his sermon over someone's life. He'd been given a moment to be what he'd always claimed to be, and he'd failed, absolutely. No amount of time would change that truth. The only thing he could control was whether he learned from it, whether he became someone different going forward. The final speaker at the Open Door Festival was a surprise. Reverend Coleman, now 83 and officially retired for 7 years, had been invited to give closing remarks. She walked slowly to the podium, her hands shaking slightly, but her voice still strong. "I've been asked to talk about forgiveness," she began. "About whether what happened here 10 years ago can be forgiven, should be forgiven, and I'll tell you what I've learned. Forgiveness isn't about saying what happened was okay. It's about refusing to let that moment define us forever. We forgive not for the person who hurt us, but to free ourselves from being forever victims of their actions." She looked out at the crowd, her eyes finding Evan and Rachel in the front row. This young man and his mother have every right to be angry for the rest of their lives. That door slammed, those minutes were wasted. The trauma was real. But look what they chose instead. They chose to see the people who ran into the rain. They chose to be part of rebuilding something better. They chose growth over bitterness. That's not weakness, that's the kind of strength most of us will never fully understand. Then she turned to address the camera that was live streaming the event. And to the person whose name we don't say here anymore, because it doesn't matter. If you're watching, if you're listening, know this. What you did was wrong. It will always have been wrong. No time, no distance, no apology changes that. But you're not beyond redemption. None of us are. Redemption doesn't mean everyone forgives you or forgets or welcomes you back. It means you spend the rest of your life being better. Not for applause or recognition, but because it's right. Do that. Be that. It won't undo what happened, but it might prevent the next door from being slammed. The crowd gave Reverend Coleman a standing ovation. Evan wiped tears from his eyes. Rachel held her son's hand, thinking about all the doors that had opened in the 10 years since that terrible day. Margaret smiled, remembering the moment she'd stood up in that pew and decided to run toward a child instead of away. Thomas nodded approvingly, already planning the next community project, the next door to open, the next person to help. And far away in his small apartment, Nathaniel Warren closed his laptop and sat in silence. He'd heard Reverend Coleman's words. He'd seen what Cornerstone had become. He understood, finally, that his story didn't end with redemption. It ended with a choice to do better, witnessed by no one, applauded by no one, acknowledged by no one. Just the quiet, unglamorous work of being a decent person when no one was watching. Just the simple act of making sure that if another child ever knocked on his door, no matter where he was, no matter what he was doing, he would open it. Always. The rain still fell sometimes in Millbrook. Storms still rolled through, darkening skies and flooding streets. But now when they did, people knew where to go. They knew which doors would open. They knew who would run toward crisis instead of away from it. And every time those heavy oak doors at Cornerstone swung wide to welcome someone in need, every time the congregation rallied around a family in trouble, every time Thomas climbed another metaphorical ravine to help another stranger, they were writing a new ending to that old story. They were proving that one man's failure didn't have to be the final word, that doors once slammed could be opened again, that faith, broken and betrayed, could be rebuilt stronger than before. The sound of that door closing still echoed. It always would. But now it was joined by the sound of doors opening, of footsteps running into rain, of voices saying, "Come in, we'll help, you're not alone." Those sounds, louder and more persistent, were drowning out that terrible slam. Not erasing it, but transforming its meaning. From an ending to a beginning. From failure to a call to be better. From one closed door to 1,000 open ones. And somewhere in that transformation, in that choice to grow rather than hide, Millbrook found what every community ultimately needs. Not perfection, but the courage to confront imperfection. Not leaders who claim to have all the answers, but people willing to admit when they've failed. Not doors that shut out the desperate, but arms that reach toward them. Not sermons about compassion, but actions that prove it. That was the legacy of that rainy Sunday morning. Not shame, though there was shame. Not anger, though there had been anger. But ultimately hope. The stubborn, resilient, transformative hope that people can change, that communities can heal, that faith, properly understood and honestly lived, means keeping your doors unlocked always and forever. If you found meaning in this story, consider sharing it with others who might need to hear it. Remember that your actions speak louder than any sermon ever could. And if someone knocks on your door, no matter who they are or what they need, remember a child named Evan who ran through the rain looking for help. Remember that opening doors is what separates faith from hypocrisy. Remember that every single one of us, at some point, will need someone to open a door for us. Be the person who does. Until next time.